What if everything you thought you knew about the ancient Druids was just the tip of a much deeper, more mysterious story? We've all heard the familiar images: white-robed figures in misty forests, conducting enigmatic rituals beneath ancient oaks. But what if these popular portrayals barely scratch the surface of who these people truly were? For centuries, the Druids have remained one of history's most captivating enigmas, their true nature hidden behind layers of myth, speculation, and deliberate secrecy. They were far more than just Celtic priests. They were philosophers, astronomers, legal experts, and political advisors whose influence stretched across ancient Europe. Yet despite their significance, much of their story has been lost to time, waiting to be rediscovered. Imagine standing in an ancient grove, surrounded by towering trees that have witnessed ceremonies we can only begin to comprehend. The air is thick with the scent of earth and mystery, and somewhere in the shadows, the echoes of chants and wisdom spoken thousands of years ago seem to linger. The Druids left no written records of their own, choosing instead to pass their knowledge orally from generation to generation, a deliberate act that has both preserved their mystique and obscured their reality. What secrets did they guard so carefully? What truths about the natural world, the cosmos, and human existence did they understand that we're still trying to piece together today? Their disappearance from history feels like a puzzle with missing pieces, each fragment hinting at a richer, more complex picture than we've been led to believe. This journey we're about to take together isn't just about uncovering facts, it's about connecting with a lost world of profound wisdom and hidden knowledge. We'll explore how the Druids shaped societies, advised kings, and maintained a spiritual connection to nature that feels both ancient and strikingly relevant today. From their possible role in building mysterious stone circles to their tragic encounter with the expanding Roman Empire, their story is one of brilliance, resilience, and ultimate mystery. So join me as we peel back the layers of time, challenge the myths, and venture into the shadowy corners of history to discover the true legacy of the Druids, a journey that promises to change how you see the ancient world and perhaps even our place within it today. To understand the Druids, we must first step into the vibrant, interconnected world of the ancient Celts. They were not a single, unified people, but a collection of numerous tribes spread across a vast swath of Europe, from Anatolia in the east to the farthest western shores of Ireland and Spain. It was within these diverse Celtic societies that the Druids emerged not merely as religious figures, but as the very pillars of their civilization. They were the intellectual and spiritual elite, a class of professionals whose training could last 20 years and whose knowledge encompassed everything from the divine to the deeply practical. Their role in society was astonishingly comprehensive. As priests, they presided over the most sacred rituals and acted as intermediaries between the people and the countless gods and spirits that inhabited the Celtic world. They determined the most auspicious days for planting, for battle, and for celebration by reading the complex patterns of the natural world and the night sky. But their influence extended far beyond the ceremonial. Druids were also the judges, the arbiters of law who settled disputes between tribes and individuals. Their legal decisions were considered absolute and final, binding all parties through a powerful combination of social authority and deep-seated religious belief. Furthermore, they were the historians, the poets, and the philosophers, the guardians of all tribal knowledge and lore. In a culture that valued the spoken word over the written, a Druid's memory was a living library. They committed thousands of verses, complex legal precedents, and intricate genealogies to memory, passing this immense oral tradition down through generations. This immense responsibility placed them at the very top of the Celtic social hierarchy, often above even kings and chieftains. A king ruled through strength and lineage, but a Druid advised through wisdom and divine connection, and it was said that no chieftain would dare make a momentous decision without first seeking their counsel. While the most famous classical accounts from writers like Julius Caesar come from his campaigns in Gaul, modern-day France, the Druidic tradition was by no means limited to that region. Evidence of their presence and profound importance is strongest in the islands of Britain, and especially Ireland. Irish mythology and later medieval texts, which were likely based on much older oral traditions, paint a particularly detailed picture of the Druids. They show us figures like Cathbad, the legendary Druid of the Ulster cycle, who was a prophet, a teacher, and a powerful political advisor. The survival of these traditions in Ireland, which was never conquered by Rome, offers a unique and slightly less filtered window into their world, suggesting a class of individuals who are deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, from the royal court to the remote rural settlement. Within this revered intellectual class, there was a well-defined structure, a hierarchy of knowledge and responsibility that guided a person's entire life. The path to becoming a full Druid was not a quick one. It was a lifelong commitment of intense mental and spiritual training, often beginning in childhood. This journey typically progressed through 3 distinct stages, each with its own focus and sacred duties: the Bard, the Ovate, and finally, the Druid. A student's first step was to enter the order of the Bards. Far more than mere entertainers, the Bards were the keepers of memory and the masters of language. Their training was fundamentally about the power of the spoken word. They learned to compose and recite incredibly long and complex poems, songs, and stories that contained the entire history, genealogy, and mythology of their people. A skilled bard's memory was a vast living archive. They could recite the lineage of a chieftain's family back for generations, recall the precise terms of ancient laws and treaties, and immortalize the deeds of heroes in epic tales. This was how a culture without widespread literacy preserved its identity. The bard used music, rhyme, and rhythm as mnemonic devices, turning history into an unforgettable performance. Their role was crucial for maintaining social cohesion, reinforcing cultural values, and providing legitimacy to rulers through the authoritative recitation of their noble ancestry. After mastering the arts of the bard, a student could advance to the rank of Ovate. This stage represented a significant shift in focus from the arts of culture to the mysteries of nature and the unseen world. The Ovate was a seer, a healer, and a philosopher of the natural order. Their studies delved into herbalism, medicine, and divination. They learned to read omens in the flight patterns of birds, to interpret dreams, and to understand the healing properties of plants. The Ovate was deeply connected to the cycles of life, death, and rebirth, often acting as a guide for the community in matters of health and spiritual well-being. They were the intermediaries between the physical world and the spirit world, seeking to understand and influence the forces that shaped human destiny. This required not just knowledge, but a profound intuitive connection to the hidden workings of the universe. Only after decades of mastering both the poetic arts of the bard and the natural philosophy of the Ovate could a person aspire to the highest rank, that of the Druid proper. This was the pinnacle of the intellectual and spiritual journey. A full Druid synthesized all previous knowledge into a role of ultimate leadership and responsibility. They were the judges, the advisors to kings, the theologians, and the masters of astronomy and calendar keeping. Their understanding of the movements of the stars and planets allowed them to maintain the complex calendar that dictated the timing of all religious festivals, agricultural activities, and political events. Their word in legal matters was absolute, and their authority often superseded that of tribal chieftains. This immense power was earned through a grueling process of learning that could span 20 years or more, all committed to memory. To become a Druid was to become the living embodiment of a tribe's wisdom, law, and connection to the divine, a walking library and a supreme authority whose guidance was sought for every decision of consequence. This immense repository of knowledge, encompassing everything from the movements of the stars to the intricacies of tribal law, was not stored on parchment or carved into stone. It was housed entirely within the minds of the Druids, preserved through an oral tradition of breathtaking rigor and sophistication. The decision to prohibit writing down their most sacred teachings was not a result of primitiveness, but a deeply philosophical and strategic choice. They believed that true wisdom was a living, breathing thing that could not be captured by static marks on a page. Knowledge transmitted orally was dynamic. It required a direct, personal connection between teacher and student, ensuring the wisdom was not just memorized but truly understood and internalized. Writing, they feared, would make the mind lazy and weaken the formidable power of memory they so valued. More importantly, it would risk their most profound secrets, their spiritual doctrines, their advanced astronomical observations, their political strategies falling into the hands of outsiders. By keeping this knowledge locked away in an exclusive oral tradition, they maintained a powerful monopoly on the intellectual and spiritual life of their people, ensuring their indispensable role in Celtic society. The education required to become a custodian of this knowledge was accordingly monumental, a mental and spiritual marathon that could span 2 decades. Imagine a young initiate leaving their family to study under a master druid, not in a formal schoolhouse, but within the vast, open-air cathedral of a sacred grove or near a hallowed spring. Their curriculum was all-encompassing. They committed to memory thousands of verses of poetry, which served as a mnemonic device for encoding complex information. Through these poems, they learned a sophisticated system of astronomy that allowed them to create a precise lunar-solar calendar, predicting seasonal changes, eclipses, and the dates of all-important festivals like Samhain and Beltane with remarkable accuracy. This wasn't just abstract science, it was essential for determining the optimal time to plant crops, to launch military campaigns, and to conduct ceremonies that they believed maintained the balance between the human and divine worlds. Their studies extended far beyond the celestial. Druidic education included a profound system of natural philosophy, exploring the essence of the divine and the fundamental principles governing the universe, including a belief in the immortality of the soul and its transmigration between worlds. They were also master jurists. The complex Brehon laws of Ireland, which detailed everything from property rights to compensation for injuries, were memorized and interpreted by the Druids. Their role as judges was absolute because they alone held the entire legal code in their heads, allowing them to adjudicate disputes between powerful chieftains and ensure social order. This combination of roles, priest, scientist, philosopher, and lawyer, created a uniquely holistic world, where every aspect of life, from the laws of men to the laws of nature, was seen as interconnected and sacred. This immense intellectual feat was achieved through a culture that revered and trained memory to a degree that is almost unimaginable in our written word-dependent society. The mind of a master druid was a perfectly organized, fault-tolerant library. Techniques of memorization were paramount, using rhythmic poetry, symbolic imagery, and associative learning to create vast mental palaces of information. A single druid could recall the complete genealogies of every noble family for generations, the entirety of tribal mythologies that explained the world's creation, and the precise wording of legal judgments from centuries past. This was not mere rote repetition. It was the cultivation of a living, accessible database within the mind, ensuring that the culture's most vital information could be recalled instantly, debated, and applied to any situation, all without a single written note. This incredible reliance on memory forged a direct, unbroken chain of wisdom from one generation to the next, making each druid a living archive and the very heartbeat of their civilization. Now, to truly step into the world of the Druids, we must leave the written accounts and enter the physical spaces they are most famously associated with, the breathtaking, enigmatic monuments that still dot the landscapes of Britain and Ireland. The great stone circles, burial mounds, and ceremonial complexes like Stonehenge, Avihenny, and Newgrange feel like permanent echoes of a distant past. And for centuries, the popular imagination has placed the white-robed Druids at the center of these sites, conducting their solemn rituals. But this connection, while powerful, is one of history's most fascinating and complex puzzles, a blend of tantalizing possibility and chronological complication. The first thing we must understand is a matter of time. The iconic Stonehenge that we recognize today was largely completed over 1,000 years before the Druidic order ever emerged in the historical record. Its main construction phases occurred between 3,000 and 2,500 years before the Common Era, a product of Neolithic Britons whose name and specific beliefs are entirely lost to us. The Druids, as we've come to know them, flourished during the Iron Age, rising to prominence centuries after the last massive stone was set in place at Stonehenge. So, if they didn't build these monuments, what was their relationship to them? It is highly likely that the Druids recognized these ancient places as profoundly sacred. Imagine an Iron Age Druid standing before the towering sarcens of Stonehenge, a structure already older to them than the Roman Colosseum is to us today. They would have seen a landscape already saturated with the power and presence of their ancestors, a ready-made temple of immense power and astronomical precision. The sophisticated alignment of Stonehenge with the solstices, where the sun rises directly over the heel stone on the summer solstice and sets between the great trilithons on the winter solstice, would have been perfectly in line with the Druids' own deep study of the heavens. They were the astronomers and calendar keepers of their time, and they would have intuitively understood the purpose of this ancient clock. It is not difficult to picture them adopting this pre-existing, powerful site for their own ceremonies, perhaps reinterpreting its significance within their own complex spiritual framework to connect their people to a timeless, hallowed past. This theory of adoption and reinterpretation gains even more traction when we look across the sea to Ireland, at the magnificent passage tomb of Newgrange. Built over 5,000 years ago, this massive grass-covered mound contains a long, narrow passage that leads to a central chamber. For a few precious minutes at dawn on the winter solstice, a shaft of sunlight pierces through a specially designed opening above the entrance, known as the roof box, and slowly illuminates the inner chamber in a breathtaking display of ancient engineering. This event would have held tremendous significance for the Druids, marking the death and rebirth of the sun at the year's darkest point, a core theme in their own beliefs about the cycles of nature and the immortality of the soul. While they did not build Newgrange, it is almost certain they knew of its power and likely incorporated it into their own mythologies and ritual practices, viewing it as a tangible point of connection between the earthly world and the divine. Beyond these famous sites, the archaeological record provides clues to more definitively Iron Age ritual practices that we can directly link to the Druids. In places like Anglesey in Wales, which classical writers referred to as a major Druidic stronghold, and at the lake site of Lyn Cerrig Bog, archaeologists have uncovered vast hoards of ritual deposits. These aren't simple collections of everyday items. They are staggering caches of weaponry, intricately decorated metalwork, cauldrons, and even chariot fittings, all deliberately broken and offered to the waters. This practice of votive deposition aligns perfectly with Celtic beliefs in watery thresholds as portals to the other world. The act of taking objects of great value and status, swords ritually bent, shields beautifully decorated, and committing them to the lake forever was a powerful sacrament, a negotiation with the gods that only a learned spiritual authority like a Druid could have officiated. These finds provide a tangible, physical link to the rituals the classical authors described, evidence of a complex sacrificial economy meant to maintain the cosmic balance. So, while the Druids may not have been the architects of the oldest stone circles, they were almost certainly their chief interpreters and high priests in a later age. They were the inheritors of a sacred landscape, the learned scholars who would have decoded the astronomical alignments and harnessed the innate spiritual power of these places for their people. Their ceremonies likely blended the very old with the new, using the ancient cyclical language of the sun and stars spoken by monuments like Stonehenge and Newgrange to affirm their own teachings about the nature of the universe, the gods, and the human soul. These sites became the ultimate stage for their authority, a physical manifestation of their claimed connection to the deepest mysteries of life, death, and the cosmos itself. This profound connection to the natural world found its ultimate expression in the Druids' mastery of the heavens, a sophisticated understanding of astronomy that allowed them to create a complex and precise calendar system. Their role as timekeepers was not merely a practical duty, it was a sacred responsibility, a way of harmonizing human life with the divine rhythms of the cosmos. At the heart of this system were the 4 great fire festivals that marked the turning of the year, each one a powerful hinge between the seasons and the spirit world. Samhain, celebrated from sunset on October 31st into November 1st, was perhaps the most potent. It was the Celtic New Year, a time when the veil between the worlds was at its thinnest. This was not a night of fear, but a solemn moment of communion with ancestors, a time to extinguish old hearth fires and relight them from a sacred, communal Druidic flame. It marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of the dark, introspective half of the year, a period for storytelling, law-giving, and honoring the dead. Directly opposite on the wheel of the year was Beltane, beginning on the eve of May 1st. Where Samhain welcomed the dark, Beltane celebrated the light, fertility, and the blossoming of life. Cattle were driven between 2 large bonfires to be purified and protected before being released into summer pastures, and communities engaged in rituals to ensure the land's vitality. The other 2 festivals, Imbolc on February 1st and Lugnasad on August 1st, completed this sacred cycle. Imbolc, associated with the goddess Brigid, was a gentle festival of awakening when the first lambs were born and the sun's strengthening light promised the end of winter. Lugnasad was the first harvest festival, a time of gathering the early grains and holding athletic games and fairs to celebrate the community's strength and abundance. These 4 points were not determined by a fixed solar date, but by a deep sensitivity to the natural world, the behavior of animals, the budding of plants, and the position of the moon and stars. The most stunning evidence of their advanced timekeeping is the Coligny calendar, a remarkable bronze plaque discovered in France in 1897. This isn't a simple list of days, it's an intricate 5-year metonic cycle designed to synchronize the moon's cycles with the solar year. The calendar is laid out in 12 lunar months, each beginning with the new moon, but to keep this 354-day lunar year aligned with the 365-day solar year, the Druids ingeniously inserted an extra month every 2.5 years. The calendar meticulously marks each day, classifying them as either auspicious or inauspicious for certain activities, a clear indication of how celestial movements dictated the rhythm of daily life, from when to plant crops to when to convene legal assemblies or launch a military campaign. Its complexity reveals a society with a highly mathematical and observational grasp of celestial mechanics that rivals many contemporary civilizations. This knowledge was not theoretical. It was physically enacted in the world through the precise alignment of their sacred sites with celestial events. While they may not have built Stonehenge, they undoubtedly understood and utilized its grand design. The heel stone's perfect alignment with the summer solstice sunrise would have been a moment of supreme spiritual significance, a confirmation of their astronomical predictions, and a time for powerful ceremonies affirming the sun's peak power. Similarly, the winter solstice alignment at Newgrange, where a beam of light illuminates an inner chamber built millennia earlier, would have been seen as a divine validation of their beliefs in rebirth and the eternal cycle of the soul. The Druids were the inheritors and active interpreters of this ancient landscape, using these permanent stone computers to anchor their calendar and give their rituals immense tangible power. Their observations extended far beyond the solstices. They tracked the complex 19-year cycle of the moon, known as the Metonic cycle, which is the foundation of the Coligny calendar. They likely followed the paths of planets and the patterns of stars, using them for navigation and to mark other important seasonal transitions. This wasn't science for its own sake, it was a form of sacred technology. By predicting an eclipse, a Druid didn't just demonstrate intellectual superiority. They demonstrated a direct channel to the gods, an ability to foresee the moment when the divine order manifested in the sky for all to see. This command of the heavens was the ultimate source of their authority, proving they held the keys to understanding the very fabric of time, the seasons, and humanity's place within the vast, orderly, and beautiful machinery of the universe. Yet for all their intellectual and spiritual authority, the most controversial and misunderstood aspect of the Druids remains their ritual life, particularly the practice of sacrifice. The classical Roman sources, most notably Julius Caesar, paint a graphic and terrifying picture of human sacrifice, describing huge wicker men filled with living people and set ablaze, or victims having their throats cut in gruesome ceremonies. It is crucial, however, to approach these accounts with a critical eye. Caesar had a powerful political motive to portray the Celts as savage barbarians. Justifying his brutal conquest of Gaul required dehumanizing its people and their culture, presenting their subjugation as a civilizing mission. While archaeological evidence does suggest that ritual killing was a part of some Celtic religious practices, the scale and sensational nature described by the Romans were likely exaggerated for propaganda purposes. A more nuanced view, supported by archaeological finds like the famously preserved Lindo Man in England, suggests that what the Romans interpreted as senseless brutality may have been extremely rare and profoundly symbolic acts. Lindo Man was a young man who suffered a ritualistic triple death, a blow to the head, garroting, and a cut to the throat before being placed in a bog, a landscape considered a sacred threshold to the otherworld. This was not random violence, but a highly structured offering, possibly enacted during a time of extreme crisis, such as a famine or invasion, to appease the gods and restore cosmic balance. The life of one individual, often a high-status person or a captured enemy, was offered to secure the survival and prosperity of the entire community. This stark concept, while alien to modern sensibilities, was viewed as the ultimate transaction with the divine, a desperate plea to maintain the natural order. Far more common than human offerings were the vast hordes of animal and object sacrifices found across Europe. The discovery at Llyn Cerrig Bog in Wales is a perfect example. A collection of beautiful swords ritually bent, ornate chariot fittings and cauldrons, all deliberately broken and cast into a lake. This practice of votive deposition reveals a sophisticated spiritual economy. By taking objects of immense material and symbolic value, the tools of warfare, status, and feasting, and willingly destroying them, the community, guided by the Druids, was making a tangible investment in the goodwill of the gods. These were not discards but gifts offered at watery portals believed to be gateways to the divine, in exchange for victory, protection, or abundance. The act of breaking the objects, known as ritual killing, may have been intended to release their essence, sending their power into the spiritual realm. Beyond these dramatic sacrifices, Druidic rituals permeated the daily and seasonal life of the people. Healing ceremonies, often led by ovates, combined practical herbal knowledge with deep spiritual belief. A healing ritual might involve the application of poultices made from specific sacred plants, gathered at an astrologically significant time, accompanied by chants or invocations to a deity of healing like Brigid. The healer viewed illness as an imbalance not just of the body but of the spirit, and their treatment sought to restore harmony on all levels. Divination was another critical function, a way of seeking guidance from the unseen world. Druids practiced extispicy, the reading of omens in the entrails of sacrificed animals, and augury, interpreting the flight patterns and calls of birds. They might also have sought prophecies through dreams induced by trances or rituals, interpreting the visions to advise a chieftain on whether to go to war or to foresee the outcome of a coming season. The most accessible and enduring of their rituals were the great seasonal fire festivals that marked the turning of the year. We touched on their calendar, but the ceremonies themselves were powerful communal events that blended the sacred and the social. At Samhain, the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead dissolved. It was a solemn, reflective time when families honored their ancestors, leaving offerings of food and drink, while the Druids presided over the sacred duty of extinguishing all hearth fires and relighting them from a central, communal flame to symbolize a unified new beginning. Beltane, by contrast, was a vibrant celebration of life and fertility. Great bonfires were lit, and cattle were driven between them to be purified and protected from disease before being released to summer pastures. Communities engaged in feasts, games, and rituals meant to ensure the land's vitality and the people's prosperity. These festivals were not mere parties. They were essential rituals of renewal, orchestrated by the Druids to align the rhythm of human life with the eternal cycle of nature, ensuring the continued favor of the gods and the stability of the world itself. When we picture the ancient Druids, the image that often springs to mind is that of a venerable old man with a long white beard, perhaps standing solemnly before a stone circle. This classic portrayal, heavily influenced by later romanticized art and literature, has cemented a largely male-dominated view of this intellectual class. But if we look more closely at the original sources and the broader context of Celtic society, a far more complex and equitable picture begins to emerge, one that challenges our modern assumptions and reveals a world where spiritual power was not defined by gender. To understand this, we must first appreciate the remarkable status of women in Celtic cultures, which stood in stark contrast to many of their contemporaries in the Mediterranean world. Classical writers like the Greeks and Romans, whose own societies were intensely patriarchal, frequently expressed shock and even disdain at the level of authority and independence Celtic women could command. Women could own property in their own right, initiate divorce, and were renowned as powerful warriors and military leaders. The legendary Queen Boudica of the Iceni is the most famous example, who led a massive and devastating revolt against the Roman occupation of Britain. While her exact status is debated, ancient historians like Cassius Dio specifically described her invoking the power of a goddess in a manner that was deeply ritualistic, suggesting she was either advised by Druids or was herself performing a role that blended political leadership with spiritual authority. This fluidity between the secular and the sacred opens the door to a fascinating possibility. Indeed, there is direct evidence within the ancient texts for the existence of female Druids. The Gaulish word for a female Druid was bandrui, meaning woman Druid, and these figures appear in several Irish myths and legends. The Ulster Cycle, one of the great bodies of Irish mythology, tells of a bandrui named Fedelm, a prophetess from Connacht. When she appears to the Queen Madibi, she is explicitly introduced as a Banfaith, a female seer or prophet, who has just returned from training in Alba, the ancient name for Britain. This mirrors the 20-year educational journey of male Druids, strongly suggesting she underwent the same rigorous intellectual and spiritual training. She is then asked to foretell the fate of the army, and she delivers a grim and accurate prophecy of its defeat, a classic Druidic function. Her presence in the story is not treated as an anomaly, but as a respected and feared authority figure. Beyond these specific titles, Celtic mythology is rich with powerful goddesses and female figures who embody the very wisdom and magical prowess associated with the Druidic order. The Morrigan is a goddess of sovereignty, war, and fate, often appearing as a crow on the battlefield whose prophecies could shape the outcome of entire conflicts. Brigid, later syncretized with a Christian saint, was a goddess of poetry, healing, and smithcraft, three arts deeply connected to the three branches of the Druidic learned classes. The fact that the divine feminine was so strongly associated with these core Druidic domains of knowledge, law, prophecy, healing, and craft makes it logical that human women would have been central to their practice on Earth. The gods a society worships often reflect its own social structures, and a pantheon filled with powerful, intelligent goddesses suggests a culture more open to female authority. Archaeology, while unable to label a skeleton as a druid, provides tantalizing clues that support this literary evidence. High-status burials of women from the Iron Age often include objects that hint at ritual or prophetic roles. Some female graves contain items like wands, finely decorated mirrors, and collections of unusual or rare items that look less like personal adornment and more like a ritual toolkit. A mirror, for instance, might not have been a simple vanity object but a tool for scrying or divination, a way of seeing into the other world. The discovery of such artifacts in the graves of women who are also buried with signs of great wealth and status implies they held a respected and specialized position in their community that went far beyond the domestic sphere, one that involved mediating with the spiritual realm. This evidence points toward a spiritual landscape where the distinction between a male druid and a female bandrui may have been one of specialization rather than hierarchy. It is possible that certain rituals, forms of divination, or healing practices were particular domains of female spiritual practitioners, drawing on their connection to specific goddesses or natural cycles. Their authority would have been just as respected and their training just as demanding as that of their male counterparts. The Celtic spiritual worldview was fundamentally about balance, the balance between the seen and unseen, the human and the natural, the masculine and the feminine. It would have been incongruous for such a philosophy to entirely exclude women from its highest intellectual and spiritual offices. The pursuit of wisdom was seen as a universal path, and the ability to walk it was granted by talent and dedication, not restricted by gender. This re-examination doesn't just add women to the historical record. It fundamentally changes our understanding of Druidism itself, revealing it as a tradition where insight could come from any mind sharp enough to grasp the mysteries of the universe. Beyond their sacred and scholarly duties, the Druids held one of the most critical and practical roles in Celtic society. They were the supreme legal authorities. Their word was law, their judgments absolute, and their intricate legal codes formed the very backbone of social order across the disparate tribes. This system of justice was not based on the decrees of a king or the whims of a ruler. It was a sophisticated body of Brehon law, a complex and nuanced set of principles memorized, interpreted, and enforced exclusively by the Druidic class. Their authority in legal matters was so profound that even the most powerful chieftain would not dare challenge a ruling from a senior druid, for it was believed their decisions were guided not only by deep learning but by divine wisdom. The legal framework they upheld was astonishingly detailed and progressive for its time. Brehon law covered every conceivable aspect of life, from contracts and property rights to compensation for injuries and the intricate protocols of hospitality. Rather than focusing primarily on punishment, this system emphasized restoration and balance. If one person harmed another, the law provided a precise schedule of compensation, known as Eric fine, designed to make the victim whole and restore harmony to the community. The payment for losing an eye in a fight, for instance, was meticulously calculated based on the victim's social status, the context of the altercation, and even the long-term impact on their livelihood. This was a legal system that understood proportionality and context, moving beyond simple retribution to a more holistic concept of justice. A Druid judge's role in dispute resolution was that of a mediator, an investigator, and an arbiter. When a case was brought before them, they would listen to all parties, call upon witnesses, and then meticulously apply the vast repository of legal precedents they held in their memory. They would recite the relevant laws, often in the form of poetic verse which served as a mnemonic device, and deliver a judgment that specified the exact compensation owed. Their power to enforce this ruling did not come from a police force or a prison system, but from something far more powerful, social and spiritual authority. To defy a Druid's judgment was to place oneself outside the protection of the law and the gods. It meant becoming an outcast, shunned by the community and stripped of all legal rights, a fate most considered worse than death. This immense responsibility required a staggering depth of knowledge. A Druid had to commit to memory the entire legal corpus for their tribe, a process that could take decades of study. They weren't just memorizing rules, they were internalizing a vast web of interconnected principles, historical judgments, and complex poetic phrasing that encoded the law. This oral tradition ensured the law remained a living, breathing entity, adaptable to new situations through debate and interpretation among the learned class, yet consistent enough to provide stability. The fact that this intricate system functioned across centuries without being written down is a testament to the incredible intellectual capacity the Druids cultivated and the deep respect Celtic society had for the rule of law as administered by its most wise and learned members. This profound bond with the natural world was the very bedrock of Druidic spirituality, a relationship far deeper than simple appreciation. It was a form of intimate, sacred communion. For the Druids, the entire cosmos was alive with divine presence, a concept known as animism. They did not believe that gods lived separately in a distant heaven. Instead, they saw the divine woven into the very fabric of existence, manifesting in every stream, mountain, storm, and stone. This worldview fostered a relationship of deep reverence and mutual respect with the environment, where every element of nature was not a resource to be exploited, but a teacher, a guardian, and a living embodiment of the sacred. This veneration was perhaps most powerfully expressed in their relationship with trees, and among them, the mighty oak held a place of supreme honor. The oak was revered not just for its strength and longevity, but for its perceived role as a cosmic connector. Its deep roots plunged into the underworld, its massive trunk stood firm in the middle world of humans, and its high branches reached toward the upper world of the heavens and celestial bodies. It was seen as a living axis mundi, a world tree that linked all realms of existence. The very word Druid is thought by many scholars to be derived from the Celtic words for oak and knowledge or to see, effectively translating to oak knower or one with the knowledge of the oak. This suggests that wisdom itself was intrinsically linked to understanding this sacred tree and the secrets it held. Their most sacred rituals were performed not within man-made temples, but in natural cathedrals known as Nemeton's sacred groves, often of oak trees. These were not merely convenient clearings in the woods, they were consecrated spaces set apart from the mundane world and pulsating with spiritual energy. A Nemeton was a place where the veil between worlds was believed to be thin, where communication with the gods and spirits of nature was most potent. To desecrate such a grove was considered one of the most grievous sins possible. The Roman writer Lucan described these groves with a mix of awe and fear, noting that they were places of such profound sanctity that even the sunlight seemed to hesitate at the edge, and the very air within felt ancient and heavy with power. It was here that the Druids would conduct their most important ceremonies, their voices blending with the rustle of leaves and the songs of birds, performing rituals under the watchful presence of their arboreal guardians. Beyond the oak, the entire forest was a source of wisdom, healing, and magic. Different trees were believed to possess unique spiritual properties and were used for specific purposes. The yew tree, with its incredible longevity and toxic berries, was deeply associated with death, rebirth, and the eternal nature of the soul. and they are often found in ancient churchyards that were once Druidic sacred sites. The quick-growing and versatile hazel was linked to wisdom, inspiration, and poetic insight. Its nuts were said to contain profound knowledge if one could find them. The hawthorn, often found guarding sacred wells, was a tree of purification and protection, its blossoms marking the arrival of Beltane and the height of spring's fertile power. This intricate understanding of the arboreal world formed a vital part of the ovates' training, as they learned which barks, leaves, and berries could heal a wound, induce a vision, or offer spiritual protection. This sacred connection extended to the animal kingdom as well, where creatures were seen not as lesser beings but as messengers, guides, and manifestations of specific divine qualities. The Celts did not have spirit animals in the casual modern sense. They had powerful totemic relationships with certain species. The stag, with its majestic antlers that were shed and regrew each year, was a potent symbol of cyclical renewal, virility, and a connection to the forest lord Cernunnos, often depicted in Celtic art. The wild boar represented raw courage, ferocity in battle, and untamed strength, and its image frequently adorned helmets and shields. Salmon were revered for their wisdom and knowledge, as they were believed to have consumed the hazelnuts of wisdom that fell into sacred pools from the overhanging trees. Even the humble hare was associated with transformation, mystery, and the lunar cycles due to its nocturnal habits. By observing the behavior of these creatures, the Druids and ovates sought to understand the messages of the gods and the hidden currents of the natural world, viewing them as partners in a vast, interconnected web of life that they were bound to protect and interpret for their people. Their profound connection to the natural world found one of its most practical and life-affirming expressions in the realm of medicine and healing. While the Druids are often celebrated for their astronomical and legal prowess, their role as physicians was equally vital, blending a deep, empirical knowledge of botany with a spiritual understanding of wellness that viewed disease as an imbalance of both body and soul. This holistic approach to medicine was administered primarily by the ovates, the seers and healers within the Druidic order, who spent years memorizing the properties of countless native plants, the phases of the moon most potent for harvesting them, and the intricate rituals required to activate their full healing potential. The foundation of their pharmacopoeia was the lush plant life of their homelands, and their understanding of herbalism was remarkably advanced. They knew that the bark of the willow tree, which we now understand contained salicin, the precursor to aspirin, could alleviate pain and reduce fever. They used mint to soothe digestive ailments, yarrow to staunch the flow of blood from wounds, and foxglove, which contains digitalis, in carefully measured doses to treat heart conditions. This knowledge wasn't random. It was the result of centuries of meticulous observation, experimentation, and oral transmission. An ovate would know that a plant gathered at the full moon might have different properties than one gathered at the new moon, or that a prayer spoken during harvest could imbue the medicine with spiritual efficacy. Healing was a sacred art, and the healer was a conduit between the healing powers of the earth and the suffering individual. Beyond herbal remedies, archaeological evidence and some classical accounts suggest that the Druids also practiced a form of surgery. The discovery of trep and human skulls with carefully drilled or scraped holes across Celtic Europe points to a sophisticated understanding of surgical intervention. While the exact reasons for trepanation remain debated, it was likely performed to relieve pressure from head injuries, to treat severe migraines, or perhaps even to release evil spirits believed to cause mental illness. The fact that many of these skulls show signs of healing around the edges of the hole indicates that a significant number of patients survived the procedure, a testament to the skill and cleanliness of the practitioners. They would have used specialized tools likely made of bronze or iron, and probably employed herbal antiseptics and anesthetics, such as extracts from henbane or opium poppy, to manage pain and prevent infection. This brings us to a fascinating comparison with their contemporaries, the Romans. Roman medicine, heavily influenced by Greek theory, was often based on the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and an imbalance between them. While Roman military surgeons were highly skilled at practical field medicine, especially in treating trauma injuries like sword wounds and setting broken bones, their underlying theories could sometimes lead to ineffective or even harmful practices like bloodletting. Druidic medicine, by contrast, appears to have been less theoretical and more directly observational and plant-based. They didn't seek to balance abstract humors, but to address the specific ailment with a specific remedy drawn from nature's cabinet, all within a framework that acknowledged the spiritual cause of physical illness. This isn't to say one system was outright superior to the other. Both had strengths and blind spots. The Romans excelled in public health infrastructure, building aqueducts for clean water and sewers to handle waste, which prevented disease on a massive scale. The Druids, operating within a more tribal structure, focused on individual and community-level healing. Their great strength lay in their intimate, localized knowledge of their environment. A Druidic healer knew exactly which moss grew on the north side of which oak tree that was best for packing a wound, or which spring's water, when combined with a certain herb, became a powerful tonic. This deep, place-based wisdom, passed down through generations in poetic verse to ensure its precise preservation, created a medical tradition that was both effective and deeply woven into the cultural and spiritual identity of the people. It was a system that sought to heal the whole person, restoring harmony with their community, their environment, and the gods themselves. This profound and deeply rooted spiritual power, which formed the very core of Celtic identity, presented an existential threat to one of history's most formidable expansionist empires. For Rome, the conquest of Gaul and Britain was not merely a matter of adding new territories to the map. It was a project of cultural assimilation, of reshaping conquered peoples into compliant subjects of the empire. And the Druids, as the guardians of native law, and spiritual independence, were the single greatest obstacle to this goal. They were the intellectual resistance, a unified network of influence that transcended tribal divisions and could rally opposition across all of Celtic Europe. To break the spirit of these nations, Rome knew it had to break the Druids. The campaign to eradicate their influence was methodical and brutal, a cultural war waged alongside the military one. Julius Caesar himself, in his commentaries on the Gallic Wars, identified the Druidic class as a primary target, noting that ambitious young Gauls would travel to Britain for their education, returning with anti-Roman sentiments and a fierce spirit of independence. To sever this intellectual pipeline and demoralize the population, Roman forces systematically targeted the Druids' sacred spaces. The most hallowed nemetons, the sacred groves that served as their open-air universities and temples, were deliberately desecrated and burned to the ground. This was more than just ecological destruction. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare, a message that the old gods were powerless before the legions of Rome, and that the spiritual leaders who opposed imperial rule would be shown no mercy. The culmination of this grim policy was the infamous Roman assault on the island of Mona, known today as Anglesey, in 60 AD. Under the command of the ruthless governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, a seasoned veteran who understood that some victories are won not just on the battlefield but in the minds of the conquered, the Romans assembled a force to cross the Menai Strait. Tacitus, the Roman historian, provides a chillingly vivid account of what awaited them on the opposite shore. The legions did not find a military formation ready for a conventional fight. Instead, they were met by a terrifying and otherworldly scene. Druids, both men and women, stood amidst the sacred groves, their arms raised to the heavens, unleashing a torrent of dreadful curses and imprecations against the invading soldiers. They were surrounded by wildly screaming women, hair flowing like that of the Furies, brandishing torches, and all around them moved the Druidic elite, directing a defense that was as much spiritual as it was physical. For a moment, the surreal and terrifying spectacle worked. The highly disciplined Roman soldiers, superstitious men far from home, froze in their boats, paralyzed by the fear of this unknown magic. But Suetonius Paulinus quickly rallied his troops, shouting that they must not fear a pack of fanatical women and mad priests. He urged them onward, and the professional military machine surged forward. The result was a horrifying massacre. The defenders, likely consisting of local tribespeople and the Druids themselves, were utterly overwhelmed by the heavily armed and armored legionaries. The sacred groves were methodically cut down, the altars and stone circles were smashed, and every person found on the island was put to the sword. The Romans then established a garrison on Anglesey, ensuring that this great center of Druidic learning and resistance could never rise again. The attack on Mona was not an isolated act of brutality, but a key part of a broader political strategy. The Romans understood that the Druids were a pan-tribal authority, a class that could unite disparate Celtic chieftains under a common banner of resistance by appealing to a shared cultural and religious identity. By eliminating this central nervous system of dissent, Rome could more easily implement its strategy of divide and conquer, dealing with each isolated tribe separately. Furthermore, the Druids' practice of human sacrifice, however exaggerated by Roman propaganda, provided a perfect moral justification for their eradication in the eyes of the Roman public, framing the conquest as a noble civilizing mission rather than a bloody land grab. In the face of this overwhelming force, the Druids did not simply vanish, their resistance evolved. With their physical strongholds destroyed and open practice becoming increasingly dangerous, they adapted by going underground. Their influence shifted from the public squares and sacred groves to the shadows and the whispered council in the halls of chieftains who continued to resist. They likely acted as the hidden architects of later revolts, using their network to pass messages and coordinate strategies between tribes. Their knowledge, once proudly proclaimed, became a secret to be guarded, preserved in remote rural areas and passed on in hushed tones to a select few initiates, ensuring that the flame of their tradition, though diminished, was not entirely extinguished by the iron heel of the empire. But perhaps their most powerful form of divination, and certainly the one that has captured the imagination for centuries, was prophecy. The Druids were not merely predicting the weather or the outcome of a battle. They were said to peer into the very fabric of fate itself. The most famous and enduring of these prophecies, repeated by later historians, was the foretelling of the fall of the Roman Empire. According to these accounts, the Druids prophesied that a great empire would rise and dominate the known world, but that its reign would not be eternal. They allegedly foresaw its eventual collapse, shattered from within by its own corruption and decadence, and from without by the very barbarian peoples it had sought to subjugate. For a people suffering under the Roman yoke, this was not just a prediction. It was a powerful message of hope and resilience, a spiritual resistance that assured them their oppressor's power was temporary and that the natural order would one day be restored. This long-view prophecy served to strengthen cultural identity and resolved during a time of immense pressure and change, proving that the Druids' greatest power may have been their ability to shape not just events, but the very spirit of a people. For the Druids, death was never an end, but a transition, a journey to a realm that existed alongside our own, a place of eternal youth, feasting, and peace known as the Otherworld or Anon. This was not a distant heaven in the sky, but a parallel reality, often accessible through specific, thin places in the landscape, an ancient burial mound, a mist-shrouded lake, or a lonely island on the western horizon. The Otherworld was a central, vibrant part of the Celtic spiritual imagination, a reality that shaped how they lived their lives, honored their dead, and understood their place in the cosmos. It was a realm where time flowed differently, where a single night of feasting could equate to 100 years in the mortal world, and from which heroes might return unchanged after centuries, only to crumble to dust upon touching the earth of their own time. This belief in a tangible, accessible afterlife was intimately tied to one of the most profound and distinctive Druidic doctrines, the immortality of the soul and its transmigration between worlds, a form of reincarnation. The classical writers were struck by this belief. Julius Caesar noted that the Druids taught that souls do not die, but after death pass from one to another, a conviction they held so strongly that he observed it removed the Celtic fear of death in battle. This was not a vague hope but a core tenet of their philosophy, suggesting a cyclical journey of the soul where life in this world was merely one chapter in a much longer story. A soul might be reborn into a new human body, perhaps within the same lineage to continue a family's legacy, or even into another form of life, weaving the consciousness of all living things into a continuous, interconnected tapestry of existence. This worldview made funerary practices and rituals for the dead not acts of finality, but essential ceremonies of transition and maintenance. Graves were often furnished with food, drink, weapons, and jewelry, not because the Celts believed the deceased would need them in a literal sense, but as votive offerings to aid and honor them on their journey. A warrior was sent to the other world equipped for whatever might come next, his status and identity intact. This belief system explains the great reverence for ancestors. The dead were not gone but remained a part of the community's spiritual ecosystem, capable of offering guidance and protection from the other side. This is why festivals like Samhain were so significant. They were not about fearing the dead, but about renewing that connection, thinning the veil to allow for communication and to ensure the ancestors were honored, thereby securing their continued favor for the living community. When we compare this to other Indo-European afterlife concepts, the uniqueness of the Druidic vision comes into sharper focus. The ancient Greeks and Romans often envisioned a much more somber underworld, like the gloomy, shadowy realm of Hades, where the soul existed in a dull, diminished state for eternity. Reward or punishment was typically reserved for a select few heroes or great sinners. The Norse Valhalla, while a glorious hall for slain warriors, was still a final destination, not a way station in an endless cycle. In contrast, the Druidic otherworld was generally portrayed as a universally accessible place of joy and abundance, and the cycle of rebirth offered a continuous opportunity for experience and growth. This feels less like a system of judgment and more like a natural law of the spirit, an eternal rhythm as predictable and undeniable as the turning of the seasons they so meticulously track. This profound belief in an ongoing cycle of life, death, and rebirth infused daily life with a different kind of meaning and responsibility. If every living thing possessed an immortal soul on its own long journey, then the world was inherently sacred. It fostered a deep respect for nature that went beyond simple animism. It was a recognition of kinship. It likely influenced the Celtic emphasis on honor in warfare and the complex system of restorative justice, as harming another was not just a crime against a person, but an offense against a soul whose journey stretched across lifetimes. The Druids, as the guardians of this doctrine, were therefore not just priests but guides for the soul, experts in navigating the boundaries between worlds and ensuring that both the living and the dead remained in harmony, their eternal cycles uninterrupted. Their wisdom offered a comforting, empowering answer to the great mystery of death, framing it not as a terrifying void, but as a familiar doorway to a place of peace and the promise of return. These ancient symbols were far more than simple decorations. They were a complex visual language, a way to encode profound spiritual truths and make the invisible forces of the universe tangible. In a culture that revered the spoken word over the written, these icons served as powerful mnemonic devices and sacred tools, each one a key to understanding a different facet of the Druidic worldview. The Triskelion, with its 3 spiraling arms, is one of the most ancient and potent symbols. Its name comes from the Greek for three-legged, but its meaning runs far deeper. The 3 arms represent a fundamental triad that underpinned Celtic thought: the unity of land, sea, and sky, the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, and the three domains of existence: the physical world, the world of the spirits, and the celestial realm. The perpetual motion implied by the spiral suggests a constant flow of energy between these states, an eternal process of progress and evolution. It was a symbol of personal growth, reminding the individual that advancement comes through continuous motion and harmony with these core natural forces, and it likely featured in rituals that marked important transitions or sought to harness this flowing energy. Another deeply significant emblem is the awn, a symbol that has been revived in modern Druidry but whose roots stretch back into antiquity. It consists of 3 dots often arranged vertically with 3 rays of light flowing down from them. The word awn itself means inspiration or essence in Welsh, but it signifies a divine, flowing spirit, the spark of creative and prophetic insight that was believed to come directly from the gods. The 3 rays of light are thought to represent the harmony of opposites, the left and right rays symbolizing male and female, light and dark, and other complementary forces, with the central ray embodying the perfect balance and peace that arises from their union. To receive awn was to be illuminated, to have the veil of ordinary perception lifted and be gifted with profound understanding, whether in poetry, law, or prophecy. A Druid seeking guidance might meditate upon this symbol, inviting this divine inspiration to flow into them before making a crucial judgment or composing a new sacred verse. No discussion of Celtic symbolism would be complete without the intricate and mesmerizing world of knots. These elaborate, interwoven patterns with no beginning and no end are a masterclass in symbolic meaning. The endless path of the knotwork reflects the Druidic belief in the eternal cycle of life and the interconnectedness of all things. Just as one thread loops and weaves to create a unified whole, so too are all lives, all events, and all realms seen as inextricably linked in a continuous divine tapestry. Specific patterns held specific meanings. A knotwork shield was believed to offer spiritual protection, its complex barriers confusing and trapping negative energies. Other knots symbolized the unbreakable bonds of loyalty between a chieftain and his warriors, or the eternal connection between loved ones even after death. The very act of creating these patterns, which requires immense patience and foresight, was likely a meditative practice in itself, a physical manifestation of the philosophical concept that all paths are connected and that every action ripples through the web of existence. While the previous symbols are powerful abstractions, the oak tree stands as the most potent natural symbol in the Druidic tradition. As we've explored, the very word Druid is often translated as oak knower, cementing its central role. The oak was revered for its strength, longevity, and deep-rooted stability, but its symbolism went much further. It was seen as a cosmic connector, its roots delving deep into the underworld, its trunk solidly in the middle world of humans, and its high branches stretching toward the upper world of the heavens and celestial bodies. It was a living axis mundi, a world tree that linked all realms of existence. The oak's production of both acorns and mistletoe made it doubly sacred. Acorns, potential mighty trees contained in a small shell, were symbols of potential, strength, and prosperity. The rare and mysterious mistletoe, which grows high in the oak's branches without touching the earth, was considered the most sacred of all plants, believed to be a divine manifestation, a symbol of the soul and of immortality. The famed ritual of harvesting mistletoe with a golden sickle, as described by Pliny, underscores its immense significance as a symbol of life and healing in the dead of winter. These symbols were not confined to grand rituals. They were integrated into the very fabric of daily Celtic life. A warrior might have a triskelion etched onto his shield to invoke the symbol's dynamic protective energy in battle. A craftsman might weave a specific knotwork pattern into a piece of jewelry as a talisman of good fortune for its wearer. The image of the mighty oak would be evoked in poetry to signify strength and endurance, and its wood was used to build the most important structures, from a chieftain's hall to the framework of a sacred nemeton. They were a constant visual reminder of the philosophical principles that guided their society, the cycles of nature, the flow of divine inspiration, the interconnected web of life, and the enduring strength drawn from the natural world. To wear or display these symbols was to consciously align oneself with these ancient truths, carrying a piece of the sacred into every moment of existence. Within this revered intellectual class, the bards formed the essential first tier, the foundational keepers of memory whose art was the lifeblood of Celtic culture. To become a bard was to embark on a monumental mental discipline, a training that could last up to 7 years, all dedicated to mastering the power of the spoken word. Their role was far greater than that of a simple entertainer. They were the living historians, the genealogists, and the social commentators who wielded an influence that could make or break a chieftain's reputation. In a society that placed supreme value on oral tradition over the written word, the bard's mind was a vast, meticulously organized library, and their voice was the instrument that kept the entire cultural record alive and vibrant. Their primary duty was the preservation of history, but not as a dry list of dates and events. They transformed the past into a vibrant, unforgettable performance. Through incredibly long and complex poems set to specific rhythmic patterns and musical cadences, they would recite the complete genealogy of a ruling family, tracing their lineage back through countless generations to divine ancestors and founding heroes. This wasn't just for show, it was a matter of political legitimacy. A chieftain's right to rule was proven through the bard's authoritative recitation of his noble ancestry. They also memorized the intricate details of tribal law, the terms of ancient treaties and land agreements, and the epic tales of great battles and mythological cycles. This immense repository of information was encoded using sophisticated mnemonic devices, rhyme, alliteration, and rhythmic meter, making it possible to recall thousands of lines of verse with perfect accuracy. A skilled bard was, in effect, a walking database of his people's entire identity. Beyond this function as a living archive, the bard served as a powerful social force through the art of satire. A bard's praise could elevate a leader, ensuring their deeds would be remembered for generations, but their satire was a weapon to be feared. A well-crafted satirical poem known as an air was believed to carry real magical power. It could raise boils on the face of its target, bring shame upon an entire family, or even curse a person with bad luck or illness. This power was not taken lightly. It was the bard's duty to use satire to police the community, to mock greed, cowardice, or dishonesty, and to uphold the social values of honor and generosity. A chieftain known for being stingy or unjust might find himself the subject of a cutting verse that would be repeated at every feasting hall, irreparably damaging his standing. This ability to shape public opinion made the bard a crucial check on power and a guardian of cultural morals. Their training was a rigorous process of immersion and repetition, often conducted within the secluded environment of a sacred grove under the guidance of a master bard. Students learned hundreds of traditional melodic patterns and poetic forms, each suited to a different type of story or purpose. There were specific meters for lamentations, for battle hymns, for love poetry, and for satires. They practiced the intricate art of dinsinches, the lore of place names, learning the story behind every hill, river, and forest in their territory, thus weaving the very landscape itself into the cultural narrative. This deep, localized knowledge meant that the bard didn't just tell stories. He connected his people to their land in a profound and spiritual way, making every feature of the homeland a page in their collective storybook. Ultimately, the bardic tradition was the first and most vital link in the chain of Druidic knowledge. Before a student could advance to become an ovate seer or a Druid judge, they first had to master the arts of the bard. This was because the bard's craft was the container for all wisdom. The complex laws, the astronomical observations, the healing herbs, all of this advanced knowledge was itself encoded in poetic verse, passed down through generations in a form that was both beautiful and impossible to forget. The bard was the guardian of this container, ensuring that the sacred and practical knowledge of the Druids was not written on fragile parchment, but etched into the living, breathing memory of the people to be recalled, performed, and reaffirmed with every telling, thus keeping the soul of the culture eternally present and powerfully alive. Even after the formal structure of the Druidic order was dismantled by Roman conquest, its essence refused to vanish. Instead, it underwent a remarkable transformation, seeping into the very soil of folklore and re-emerging centuries later, woven into the fabric of new traditions. This enduring influence is perhaps most vividly illustrated in the sprawling tapestry of Arthurian legend. The figure of Merlin, the archetypal wizard and advisor to King Arthur, is a direct descendant of the Druidic tradition. In the earliest Welsh texts, he is not called a wizard but a wild man of the woods, a prophet who speaks with animals and loses his mind after a great battle, retreating to the forest, a clear echo of the Druids' sacred connection to the Nemeton and the natural world. His prophetic visions, his ability to shapeshift, and his role as a political guide to a young king are all hallmarks of the powerful Bandrui and Druids of old. He is the inheritor of that ancient archetype, the wild, untamable sage whose wisdom comes not from books, but from a deep, intuitive communion with the forces of nature and the unseen realms. This pattern continues with other characters who populate the Arthurian cycle. Morgan Le Fay, often portrayed as a sorceress, embodies the traits of a healer and a mistress of magic deeply rooted in the natural world, much like an ovate. The quest for the Holy Grail itself can be read as a spiritual journey to a wondrous, life-giving cauldron, a symbol that predates Christianity and finds its origins in Celtic myth. The cauldron of Dagda in Irish legend, for instance, was said to be bottomless and could restore life to the dead, a clear precursor to the Grail's power to heal the wounded land. The knight's quest through a perilous, enchanted landscape filled with talking animals and otherworldly challenges mirrors the hero's journey in Celtic mythology, a path that requires not just strength but spiritual wisdom to navigate. These stories provided a vessel for pre-Christian Celtic values and archetypes to survive within a newly Christianized culture, allowing the old gods and wise figures to be reimagined as wizards, enchantresses, and knights on a sacred mission. The preservation of Druidic thought was not solely the work of romantic legend. It was also achieved through the diligent efforts of Christian monks in Ireland and Wales. During the early medieval period, these scribes began to write down the vast oral traditions of their people. While they often added a Christian gloss to the material, the underlying Celtic worldview shone through. The Ulster cycle and the Fenian cycle, recorded in manuscripts like the Book of the Dun Cow and the Book of Leinster, are teeming with Druids. We see figures like Cathbad, the chief Druid of the Ulster King Conchobar, who teaches the young hero Cú Chulainn and foretells his glorious but tragic destiny. These texts were not invented by the monks. They were transcriptions of an ancient oral tradition that had been maintained for centuries by the Fili, the poetic class in Ireland who were the direct successors to the bards and ovates. The Fili underwent a similar rigorous training, memorizing countless tales and genealogies, and held a high social status as advisors to kings, effectively continuing the Druidic function of cultural preservation even after the old religion had faded. This blending of traditions created a unique form of Christianity in Celtic regions, one that absorbed rather than entirely rejected the old ways. The reverence for sacred wells and springs, once sites of Druidic votive offerings, continued unabated. These were often rededicated to Christian saints like Bridget, who herself inherited the attributes of the powerful goddess Brigid, a patron of poetry, healing, and smithcraft. The Celtic cross, with its circle intersecting the arms, is thought by many scholars to be a fusion of the Christian cross with the solar disk, a potent symbol of the sun deity revered in pre-Christian times. The monastic communities that became centers of learning in early Christian Ireland and Wales were often established in remote, wild locations, on islands like Skellig Michael or in dense forests that would have been considered thin places by the Druids. This suggests a continuity of the idea that spiritual insight is found not in the crowded city, but in solitude and close proximity to the raw power of the natural world. The legacy of the Druids, therefore, is not a story of utter extinction but one of resilient adaptation. Their physical power was broken, their groves were felled, and their public influence was suppressed, but their intellectual and spiritual DNA was far too deeply encoded in the culture to ever be fully erased. It survived in the archetypes of our greatest myths, in the pages of manuscripts that preserved a pagan worldview, and in the unique character of Celtic Christianity that maintained a sense of the divine in the landscape. They ceased to be a formal institution and instead became a permanent part of the Western imagination, the eternal symbol of wisdom that is wild, ancient, and intimately connected to the mysteries of the earth and the stars. Their voice, though silenced for a time, never truly stopped speaking. It merely learned to sing a new song. For centuries after the Roman conquest, the flame of Druidic knowledge seemed to have been extinguished, surviving only in the whispered undercurrents of folklore and myth. But like a seed lying dormant through a long winter, it was waiting for the right conditions to sprout once more. That moment arrived in the 18th century, a period of tremendous social and intellectual upheaval that we now call the Enlightenment. Ironically, this age of reason, with its focus on science and empiricism, also sparked a powerful romantic counter-movement, a deep longing for a connection to a mystical, idealized past. It was within this fascinating cultural shift that the first modern Druid revival was born, not from a continuous ancient lineage, but from a powerful desire to reconnect with a lost spiritual heritage. This revival began not in a misty forest, but in a London tavern. In 1717, an eccentric antiquarian and physician named John Toland is believed to have gathered a group of like-minded intellectuals to form the first modern Druid order. This was not an unbroken continuation of an ancient priesthood. It was a conscious act of reinvention, a creative reimagining based on the classical sources and a deep, romantic fascination with Britain's Celtic past. These early revivalists were often freethinkers, drawn to the idea of a native, nature-based spirituality that stood apart from the dominant organized religions of the day. They saw in the fragmentary accounts of the Druids a noble, philosophical tradition that they believed was the original religion of humanity, a pure, uncorrupted form of worship that revered the natural world. Their gatherings, often held at the solstices at iconic sites like Stonehenge, which they famously, if anachronistically, adopted, were a blend of poetic pageantry, philosophical debate, and a sincere, if speculative, attempt to reconstruct ancient rituals. This initial spark grew throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, crystallizing into the formal organizations we recognize today. The most prominent of these is the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, or OBOD, founded in 1964 by Ross Nichols. Its very structure is a direct homage to the threefold path of ancient training we discussed earlier. Similarly, the British Druid Order and R. Andreot Fane, or a DF in the United States, emerged, each with its own unique character and emphasis. These are not monolithic institutions. Modern Druidry is a beautifully diverse tapestry of practices. Some groups are deeply spiritual, viewing Druidry as a pagan religion that honors a pantheon of Celtic deities. Others approach it as a philosophical or cultural path, a way of life focused on ethical living, environmental stewardship, and creative expression, without a necessary belief in specific gods. This spectrum allows individuals to find a connection that resonates personally, whether through deep ritual, scholarly study, or simply a profound commitment to living in harmony with the natural world. A central and fascinating challenge for all these modern practitioners is the relationship with historical accuracy. How does one revive a tradition that left no written records of its own? Contemporary Druids are the first to acknowledge that a complete, authentic reconstruction is impossible. Instead, they engage in what is often called practical romanticism or inspired reconstruction. They use the available historical clues, the accounts of classical writers, the archaeological evidence of rituals, the rich mythology preserved in Ireland and Wales, and the enduring folk customs of the Celtic nations as a foundational inspiration. Then they use intuition, meditation, and creative inspiration to fill in the immense gaps. A ritual performed at a stone circle at dawn might draw on the known Celtic reverence for the sun, incorporate a traditional invocation from a medieval Welsh poem, and include a moment of silent meditation that feels right and meaningful to the participants. It is a living tradition that respectfully uses the past as a guidepost, not a strict blueprint, allowing the practice to evolve and remain deeply relevant to people living in the 21st century. Ultimately, the heart of modern Druidry beats not in its historical reenactments, but in its powerful contemporary values. It is a path that champions ecological awareness, seeing the environmental crisis as a spiritual crisis of disconnection from the natural world. Many Druids are actively involved in conservation efforts, seeing themselves as guardians of the land. It fosters a deep commitment to creativity, viewing the arts not as a hobby but as a sacred act of manifestation, a way to channel the awe or divine inspiration. And it emphasizes community service and personal development, striving to cultivate wisdom, integrity, and compassion in everyday life. The modern Druid is just as likely to be found organizing a community tree planting event, writing poetry, or working for social justice as they are to be celebrating the solstice at a stone circle. They have taken the core principles they believe the ancient Druids embodied: a reverence for nature, the pursuit of wisdom, and the power of creativity, and woven them into a vibrant, living tradition that offers a meaningful way to navigate the complexities of the modern world, proving that the spirit of the oak knower is very much alive today. Yet for all their towering presence in the historical record, the Druids have remained a ghost in the archaeological machine. How do we find physical evidence for a class of people who committed nothing to writing and whose most sacred rituals were performed in perishable wooden groves? The challenge is immense but not insurmountable. The evidence is there, not in grand pronouncements but in whispers from the earth, in the chillingly preserved remains of the dead, in hoards of ritually broken treasure, and in the subtle residues of power at ancient sites. To find it, we must learn to read a different kind of text, one written in peat, metal, and bone. Some of the most direct and haunting evidence comes from the bogs of northern Europe. These waterlogged, acidic, and oxygen-poor environments are incredible time capsules, preserving organic materials for thousands of years. The bodies found within them, like the famous Lindo Man in England or Old Croghan Man in Ireland, are far more than ancient casualties. They are potential snapshots of ritual sacrifice. Lindo Man, for instance, suffered a violent and highly structured death around 2,000 years ago. His story is written on his body: a blow to the head, a thin cord tightened around his neck to strangle him and break his neck, and a final cut to the throat. The presence of mistletoe pollen in his stomach adds another layer of profound significance, potentially linking his death directly to a Druid-led ceremony, as mistletoe was the most sacred of all plants. These were not random acts of violence but carefully orchestrated rituals, likely performed in times of extreme crisis by spiritual specialists to appease the gods and restore cosmic balance. Beyond individual sacrifices, the archaeological record reveals a widespread practice of votive offering on a staggering scale. The discovery at Lyn Serig Bog on the island of Anglesey is a classic example. Here, during the construction of a Royal Air Force base in the 1940s, workers uncovered a massive collection of metal objects deliberately cast into a lake. The hoard included ritually bent swords, ornate chariot fittings, iron slave chains, and beautifully decorated trumpets. This was not a random dump of scrap metal, it was a deliberate collective act of devotion. These were objects of immense value and status, taken out of circulation and given to the gods. The act of bending a sword or breaking a cauldron, known as ritual killing, was likely intended to release its essence, sending its power into the spiritual realm. Such sites, often at liminal boundaries between land and water, provide tangible proof of the complex sacrificial economy the Druids oversaw, a system where material wealth was exchanged for divine favor. When searching for the Druids themselves, we must also look for the tools of their trade. While we will never find a labeled Druid's toolkit, we can infer their presence from specialized artifacts found in high-status context. A beautifully crafted bronze crown or ceremonial headpiece, like the one found at Deal in Kent, might signify a person of immense spiritual authority. A collection of surgical instruments, probes, lancets, and forceps buried alongside someone could point to a healing ovate. Perhaps most evocative are the ornate bronze spoons and divination sets found in parts of Britain and France. These spoons, often decorated with solar symbols, feature small holes and are thought to have been used for scrying or for the ritual pouring of sacred liquids during divination ceremonies. The discovery of such objects in a grave suggests the individual was a practitioner of the magical arts, someone who interpreted the will of the gods. Finally, we must consider the places where this power was concentrated. The island of Anglesey, known as Mona in Latin, was described by Roman historians as a major Druidic stronghold. Archaeology has substantiated this claim, not by finding a Druid school, but by uncovering evidence of large-scale ritual activity that aligns perfectly with classical accounts. Excavations have revealed paved precincts and ritual enclosures dating to the time of the Roman invasion, alongside a wealth of votive offerings. The remains of many individual cremations, some placed in sealed containers, suggest a sacred island landscape used for generations. Similarly, the site of Gurney-sur-Aronde in France reveals a different type of ceremonial space, a sanctuary where the bones of thousands of animals, particularly cattle, were found arranged in specific patterns alongside weapons that had been ritually destroyed. These sites, often lacking permanent temples in the Roman sense, paint a picture of a spirituality centered on processional routes, sacred enclosures, and natural features, all orchestrated by a learned class that left its mark not on architecture, but on the very pattern of how objects were placed in the landscape, waiting for us to decipher their meaning centuries later. Our window into the world of the ancient Druids, however imperfect, is framed primarily by the writings of their greatest adversaries, the Greeks and Romans. It is a fascinating paradox that we owe much of our foundational knowledge to the very civilization that sought to systematically erase them. These classical accounts, penned by authors like Julius Caesar, Cicero, Strabo, and Tacitus, are not dispassionate ethnographies. They are complex documents layered with political agenda, cultural bias, and a mixture of genuine observation and sensationalized gossip. To understand the Druids, we must first learn to read between these lines, separating the Roman spin from the Celtic reality. Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War stands as the most detailed and influential source. As a military commander engaged in a brutal, decade-long conquest of Gaul, Caesar had a powerful motive for his portrayal. He describes the Druids as a highly organized, pan-tribal intellectual class who presided over sacrifices, settled legal disputes, and were exempt from military service and taxation. His account is invaluable for its detail on their structure and their role as the ultimate authority in matters of religion, law, and education. Yet, we must never forget his underlying purpose: to justify his campaign to the Roman Senate and public. By painting the Gauls as savage barbarians whose culture was mired in horrific rituals, he framed his conquest as a noble, civilizing mission. His graphic descriptions of the infamous Wicker Man, a giant effigy filled with living people and set ablaze, served as perfect propaganda, depicting an enemy so depraved that their subjugation was not only necessary but morally righteous. Other Roman writers provide additional pieces of the puzzle, often reflecting their own particular interests. The orator Cicero briefly mentions meeting a Gallic Druid named Diviciacus of the Aedui, who was an ally of Rome. Cicero notes the Druid's knowledge of nature and his practice of divination, offering a rare first-hand account that confirms the Druids were indeed recognized as philosophers and seers, even by elite Romans. The geographer Strabo, writing a few decades later, lumps the Druids together with bards and soothsayers, highlighting their roles in sacrifice, divination, and philosophy, but also emphasizing their practice of divination through the death throes of human victims. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, provides one of the most enduring images of the Druids. He describes in great detail the ritual harvesting of mistletoe from a sacred oak with a golden sickle, a ceremony requiring pure white robes and the sacrifice of 2 white bulls. While Pliny's aim was to catalogue the natural world and its wonders, his tone is one of fascinated disdain, portraying the Druids as primitive magicians dabbling in superstitious rites. The historian Tacitus offers a chillingly vivid account from the front lines of cultural destruction. His description of the Roman attack on the Druidic stronghold on the island of Mona Anglesey is a masterclass in psychological warfare reporting. He paints a scene of chaotic terror, black-robed women resembling furies brandishing torches, Druids with arms raised to the heavens shrieking dreadful curses, and a sacred grove of trees dedicated to barbarous superstitions. Tacitus's purpose was multi-layered. While he undoubtedly aimed to thrill his Roman audience with a tale of their army's triumph over a terrifying enemy, his work also often contained a subtle critique of Roman imperialism. The scene on Mona is portrayed as much to highlight the barbarity of the enemy as to showcase the ruthless efficiency of the Roman legions in crushing a foreign culture's heart and soul. His account confirms the Druids' role as the central nervous system of native resistance, making them a primary military target. So, what can we reliably glean from these biased sources? A consistent core picture emerges across these writers, which lends it credibility. The Druids were indeed the intellectual and religious elite of Celtic society. Their roles as judges, teachers, and philosophers are repeatedly confirmed. Their practice of some form of sacrifice, including animal and potentially human, is attested by multiple sources, a fact that later archaeological evidence like Lindoman would corroborate. Their belief in the transmigration of the soul, that death was merely a pause before rebirth, is also a consistent theme, one that Caesar notes made Celtic warriors fearless in battle. Yet the classical lens severely distorts our view in 2 major ways. First, it heavily emphasizes the grotesque and the bloody, focusing on sacrifice and superstition at the expense of their deeper philosophical and scientific achievements. There is little mention in Roman texts of the Druids' sophisticated calendrical systems, their advanced astronomy, or the complex poetic meters they used to memorize lore. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the Roman view is fundamentally an external one. They observed the rituals but did not understand the theology behind them. A ritualistic killing was seen as mere bloodlust, not as a desperate spiritual transaction with the gods to ensure the community's survival. The offering of priceless objects into a lake was viewed as primitive idolatry, not a profound act of sacred economy. These accounts show us the what of Druidic practice, but they forever obscure the why, leaving us with a silhouette of their true beliefs, outlined by the light of a culture that was determined to extinguish them. Now, to truly step into the world of the Druids, we must leave the written accounts and enter the physical spaces they are most famously associated with, the breathtaking, enigmatic monuments that still dot the landscapes of Britain and Ireland. The great stone circles, burial mounds, and ceremonial complexes like Stonehenge, Avebury, and Newgrange feel like permanent echoes of a distant past, and for centuries the popular imagination has placed the white-robed Druids at the center of these sites, conducting their solemn rituals. But this connection, while powerful, is one of history's most fascinating and complex puzzles, a blend of tantalizing possibility and chronological complication. The first thing we must understand is a matter of time. The iconic Stonehenge that we recognize today was largely completed over 1,000 years before the Druidic order ever emerged in the historical record. Its main construction phases occurred between 3,000 and 2,500 years before the Common Era, a product of Neolithic Britons whose name and specific beliefs are entirely lost to us. The Druids, as we've come to know them, flourished during the Iron Age, rising to prominence centuries after the last massive stone was set in place at Stonehenge. So, if they didn't build these monuments, what was their relationship to them? It is highly likely that the Druids recognized these ancient places as profoundly sacred. Imagine an Iron Age Druid standing before the towering sarcens of Stonehenge, a structure already older to them than the Roman Colosseum is to us today. They would have seen a landscape already saturated with the power and presence of their ancestors, a ready-made temple of immense power and astronomical precision. The sophisticated alignment of Stonehenge with the solstices, where the sun rises directly over the heel stone on the summer solstice and sets between the great trilithons on the winter solstice, would have been perfectly in line with the Druids' own deep study of the heavens. They were the astronomers and calendar keepers of their time, and they would have intuitively understood the purpose of this ancient clock. It is not difficult to picture them adopting this pre-existing, powerful site for their own ceremonies, perhaps reinterpreting its significance within their own complex spiritual framework to connect their people to a timeless, hallowed past. This theory of adoption and reinterpretation gains even more traction when we look across the sea to Ireland, at the magnificent passage tomb of Newgrange. Built over 5,000 years ago, this massive grass-covered mound contains a long, narrow passage that leads to a central chamber. For a few precious minutes at dawn on the winter solstice, a shaft of sunlight pierces through a specially designed opening above the entrance, known as the roof box, and slowly illuminates the inner chamber in a breathtaking display of ancient engineering. This event would have held tremendous significance for the Druids, marking the death and rebirth of the sun at the year's darkest point, a core theme in their own beliefs about the cycles of nature and the immortality of the soul. While they did not build Newgrange, it is almost certain they knew of its power and likely incorporated it into their own mythologies and ritual practices, viewing it as a tangible point of connection between the earthly world and the divine. Beyond these famous sites, the archaeological record provides clues to more definitively Iron Age ritual practices that we can directly link to the Druids. In places like Anglesey in Wales, which classical writers referred to as a major Druidic stronghold, and at the lake site of Lyn Cerrig Bog, archaeologists have uncovered vast hoards of ritual deposits. These aren't simple collections of everyday items, they are staggering caches of weaponry, intricately decorated metalwork, cauldrons, and even chariot fittings, all deliberately broken and offered to the waters. This practice of votive deposition aligns perfectly with Celtic beliefs in watery thresholds as portals to the other world. The act of taking objects of great value and status, swords ritually bent, shields beautifully decorated, and committing them to the lake forever was a powerful sacrament, a negotiation with the gods that only a learned spiritual authority like a Druid could have officiated. These finds provide a tangible, physical link to the rituals the classical authors described, evidence of a complex sacrificial economy meant to maintain the cosmic balance. So, while the Druids may not have been the architects of the oldest stone circles, they were almost certainly their chief interpreters and high priests in a later age. They were the inheritors of a sacred landscape, the learned scholars who would have decoded the astronomical alignments and harnessed the innate spiritual power of these places for their people. Their ceremonies likely blended the very old with the new, using the ancient cyclical language of the sun and stars spoken by monuments like Stonehenge and Newgrange to affirm their own teachings about the nature of the universe, the gods, and the human soul. These sites became the ultimate stage for their authority, a physical manifestation of their claimed connection to the deepest mysteries of life, death, and the cosmos itself. For a people who placed such supreme value on the spoken word, the question of what language the Druids actually used opens a fascinating window into their intellectual world. It's a common misconception that the Celts spoke a single, unified language. In reality, the linguistic landscape of Iron Age Europe was a rich tapestry of related but distinct Celtic tongues. In Gaul, the Druids would have spoken a now extinct language known as Gaulish, a branch of the Celtic family that also included Celtiberian in Spain. Across the sea in Britain and Ireland, the picture was different. The ancestors of what we now know as Welsh, Cornish, and Breton were spoken in Britain, while the Goidelic branch, which would eventually evolve into Irish, Scottish Gaelic, and Manx, was dominant in Ireland. A Druid traveling between these regions would have been a polyglot, needing to understand the nuances and variations between these sister languages to communicate with different tribes and perhaps to learn from other Druidic centers. Their role as the most learned members of society almost certainly extended to knowledge of prestigious foreign languages, particularly Greek and later Latin. Long before Caesar's conquest, the Celtic world was deeply engaged in trade and cultural exchange with the Mediterranean. Greek colonists in Massalia, modern-day Marseille, were a key point of contact. The Greek writer Ephorus, as early as the 4th century BCE, mentioned that the Celts held the Druids in high esteem. This suggests a long history of interaction, and it is highly plausible that Druidic scholars, curious about the wider world, would have learned Greek to engage with these traders and perhaps even to access Greek philosophical and scientific ideas. Later, as Roman influence grew, knowledge of Latin would have become an essential tool of statecraft. A Druid advising a chieftain on how to negotiate with an advancing Roman legion would need to understand the language of the enemy, not just to communicate but to decipher treaties, understand Roman motives, and potentially even to spy. Their linguistic skills were a key component of their political power, allowing them to act as diplomats and intermediaries in an increasingly interconnected and tense world. This mastery of language was not merely practical, it was magical. The Druids believed that words held intrinsic power, that a correctly spoken charm could heal a wound, a well-constructed satire could raise boils on an enemy's face, and a powerfully chanted invocation could influence the weather or the outcome of a battle. This wasn't a metaphorical belief but a core tenet of their spirituality. The act of naming something was thought to grant a degree of control over it. This is why the training of the bards was so intense and why their poetry was so highly structured. The rhythmic patterns, alliteration, and complex meter were not just artistic choices but were believed to be the vessels that contained and directed this magical power. A perfectly recited genealogy did more than record history. It affirmed a leader's right to rule by magically connecting him to his divine ancestors. A law spoken in the correct poetic form was not just a rule but an incantation that wove order into the fabric of society. For the Druids, language was the ultimate technology, a divine tool that could shape reality itself. This profound relationship with the spoken word makes their interaction with writing all the more intriguing, and nowhere is this more evident than with the Ogham script. Ogham is an ancient alphabet unique to the Celtic languages of Ireland and Britain, consisting of a series of lines and notches carved into stone or wood. Traditionally, it's dated from around the 4th century CE, placing it after the peak of classical Druidism, but its origins are undoubtedly older and shrouded in myth. The medieval Irish Book of Ballamode claims it was invented by the wise god Ogma as a secret form of communication, a clue that its development may be connected to the learned classes. The script itself is elegantly simple, designed for carving on the hard edges of standing stones, with each group of lines representing a different letter in the Irish alphabet. The central, tantalizing question is, did the Druids use Ogham? The script appears on hundreds of memorial stones, often bearing the name of a person and their father, phrases like X son of Y. These inscriptions seem more commemorative than mystical. However, some scholars propose a more intriguing possibility. The simplicity of Ogham makes it ideal for quick, discrete notation. It is entirely plausible that the Druids, who forbade the writing of their sacred knowledge but still needed memory aids for their vast oral repository, used Ogham as a secret shorthand notation system. A single notch on a piece of wood could serve as a prompt for an entire complex legal ruling or a line of sacred poetry. It would have been a perfect compromise, a way to jog the memory without fully committing the secret to writing, keeping the knowledge locked away from the uninitiated. In this sense, Ogham may not have been the Druids' public billboard, but their private, coded notebook, a tool that served their vow of secrecy while supporting the immense burden of their memory. Perhaps no aspect of Druidic practice is more controversial or shrouded in sensationalism than the question of human sacrifice. For centuries, the image of the Druids has been inextricably linked to this grisly concept, largely due to the vivid and horrifying accounts penned by their Roman adversaries. The most infamous of these descriptions comes from Julius Caesar himself, who detailed the construction of a colossal effigy, a giant wicker man, which would be filled with living people and set ablaze as an offering to the gods. Another account from the writer Strabo describes a different method, a ritual where a human victim would be stabbed in the back with a sword, their death throes carefully observed by a Druid who would then divine the future from their final spasms. To the Roman reader, these stories were not just reports of foreign customs. They were powerful propaganda, carefully crafted to depict the Celtic peoples as savage barbarians whose subjugation was not only a military necessity, but a moral crusade to bring civilization to a blood-soaked land. We must approach these classical sources with a critical and discerning eye. The Romans had a long and well-documented history of exaggerating the brutality of their enemies to justify their own imperial ambitions. By painting the Druids as practitioners of the most depraved and inhuman rites, Caesar and his contemporaries provided a perfect rationale for their ruthless campaigns in Gaul and Britain. It served to dehumanize a sophisticated culture, making their destruction palatable to the Roman Senate and public. This is not to say we should dismiss their accounts entirely, but rather to read them as political documents as much as historical ones, understanding that the truth likely lies somewhere between outright fabrication and the amplification of a rare, extreme practice stripped of its cultural and spiritual context. So, what does the cold, hard evidence from the earth tell us? Archaeology provides a more nuanced, though still chilling, perspective. The discovery of bog bodies across northern Europe, particularly the remarkably preserved Lindo Man in England, offers the most direct physical evidence for ritualized killing. Lindo Man did not die a simple death. His end was a complex, multi-stage ritual. He was struck on the head, garroted to break his neck, and his throat was cut. The presence of mistletoe pollen in his stomach is particularly significant, potentially linking his death directly to a Druid-led ceremony involving this most sacred of plants. This was not a random act of murder, it was a highly structured and symbolic execution. The threefold death he suffered is a motif that appears in later Celtic mythology, suggesting it held a specific, though now lost, religious meaning. Rather than the mass spectacle sacrifices described by the Romans, the archaeological record points to something more targeted and spiritually significant. These acts were likely rare events, reserved for moments of extreme communal crisis, a devastating famine, a deadly plague, or the imminent threat of a powerful invading army. In the Celtic worldview, the world was maintained by a delicate balance between the human and divine realms. A catastrophic event signaled that this balance had been shattered. In such a dire situation, the most valuable offering possible, a human life, might be required to appease the angry gods and restore order. The victim may have been a high-status volunteer, a willing sacrifice for their people, a captured enemy warrior, or a criminal condemned to serve this final, sacred purpose. Their death was viewed not as senseless brutality, but as the ultimate transaction, a desperate plea to the divine to spare the entire community from annihilation. When we compare the limited archaeological evidence to the vast number of animal and object sacrifices found at sites like Lyn Serig Bog, it becomes clear that the everyday spiritual economy of the Celts ran on a different currency. The countless ritually killed weapons, cauldrons, and jewelry pieces deposited in lakes and bogs show that the standard offering was one of valued possessions, not human lives. The Wicker Man, as described by Caesar, may have been a colossal version of this same principle, an effigy filled with animal offerings, or perhaps, in a worst-case scenario, a handful of condemned individuals whose story was then exaggerated by Roman historians into a tale of mass slaughter. The truth is that human sacrifice was almost certainly a real, but exceptionally rare part of Druidic practice, a terrifying last resort reserved for when the very survival of the tribe was believed to be at stake. It was a profound and dark aspect of their religion, born not from a love of violence, but from a deep-seated belief in their responsibility to maintain the cosmic order, no matter the horrific cost. The fading of the Druids was not a sudden extinction, but a long, complex twilight, a gradual dimming of one light as another grew brighter. As Christianity spread through the Celtic lands of Britain, Ireland, and Gaul from the 4th and 5th centuries onward, the world that had sustained the Druidic order began to fundamentally change. The new religion arrived not only with crosses and scriptures, but with the formidable political and cultural machinery of the Roman Empire, and later, zealous missionaries who saw the old ways as diabolical superstition. For the Druids, this posed an existential crisis. Their entire authority was woven into the fabric of a pagan society. They were the judges, the historians, the intermediaries with the gods of the land. A new god who required no such intermediaries and whose representatives preached a message that directly challenged their teachings threatened to unravel their very reason for being. The response from the Druidic class was as varied as the individuals within it. Some chose the path of resistance, becoming the spiritual leaders of a cultural last stand. They would have counseled chieftains against accepting the new faith, arguing that abandoning the old gods would incur their wrath and bring misfortune upon the people. They likely performed rituals with renewed fervor, seeking omens to prove their continued relevance and power. In regions like Wales and Ireland, where Roman political control had been weak or non-existent, this resistance could have been particularly potent, with Druids acting as a unifying force against what they perceived as a foreign spiritual invasion. Their struggle was not just for religious dominance, but for the soul of their civilization, a desperate attempt to preserve a worldview thousands of years in the making. Yet for many others, the wiser course seemed to be adaptation and conversion. A pragmatic Druid, seeing the inexorable spread of Christianity and the shifting allegiances of powerful kings, might have recognized that the future belonged to the new god. Conversion offered a path to retain a measure of status and influence within the transformed social structure. Their immense learning and mastery of language were invaluable skills that the early Christian church desperately needed. There is compelling evidence that many of the first Christian monks and bishops in Ireland, in particular, were drawn from the old learned classes, the Fili, who were the direct successors to the bards and ovates. These converted scholars would have been the ones who sat down in the newly established monasteries to write. But what did they write? They committed to parchment the very myths, genealogies, and laws they had once been tasked with memorizing. In doing so, they performed the ultimate act of preservation, ensuring that the stories of the Tuatha De Danann, the epic tales of Cu Chulainn, and the wisdom of their ancestors survived, albeit often with a thin Christian veneer applied to make them palatable to the new orthodoxy. This blending is the key to understanding why Druidism didn't so much disappear as it underwent a metamorphosis. The sacred wells and springs that had been sites of Druidic votive offerings were rededicated to Christian saints like Bridget, who seamlessly absorbed the attributes of the powerful goddess she replaced. The great seasonal festivals of Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad were too deeply ingrained in the agricultural and social rhythm of life to be erased. Instead, they were rebranded as All Saints' Day, St. Bridget's Day, and various feast days, their ancient fires now kindled in a Christian context. The Celtic cross, with its circle intersecting the arms, is a powerful architectural symbol of this fusion, marrying the Christian symbol with the solar disk, a potent emblem of the pre-Christian sun deity. The question of when Druidism effectively vanished as an openly practiced religion is difficult to pinpoint. In Roman-occupied Britain and Gaul, its public institution was likely crushed within a century or two of the conquest, driven underground by a combination of military force and legal prohibition. In the remote, never-conquered corners of Ireland, however, elements of the tradition arguably persisted for much longer in the guise of the Fili, who continued to function as poets, historians, and advisors to kings well into the medieval period, their practices a curious blend of the native and the Christian. By the 8th or 9th century, the organized pagan Druidism of the Iron Age was undoubtedly gone, its last practitioners having died out or fully assimilated. But its spirit endured not as a living faith but as a deep cultural substrate, a way of seeing the world that valued poetry, revered nature, and honored the past, all of which were quietly woven into the very heart of Celtic Christianity, waiting for a future age to rediscover and reimagine the wisdom of the oak knowers. And so, the story of the Druids brings us not to a final answer, but to a profound and humbling question mark. We began this journey with a familiar image, the white-robed sage in a misty grove, and we end it by realizing that this picture is merely a single, faded brushstroke on a vast, unfinished canvas. The truth is, the Druids were everything we've explored. They were the supreme legal minds whose word could bind warring tribes, the astronomers who mapped the heavens with nothing but memory, the philosophers who pondered the soul's journey, and the healers who understood the earth's pharmacy. Yet, for all we can piece together, they remain fundamentally elusive, their deepest truths locked away in an oral tradition that died with the last initiate, leaving us to decipher echoes. This incredible ambiguity is not a failure of history, but its most captivating feature. The Druids challenge us to be comfortable with not knowing, to embrace the mystery. They force us to question the simplistic narratives we're often fed, to look beyond the Hollywood spectacles of wicker men and see instead a sophisticated intellectual class whose eradication was a strategic military priority for the most powerful empire on earth. Their history is a powerful reminder that the victors often write the first draft, and it is our job to read between the lines, to listen for the whispers in the archaeological record, and to question the sensational accounts born from propaganda. What survives more than any definitive fact is their spirit, a way of seeing the world that feels strikingly relevant today. In their reverence for the natural world, we see a mirror to our own growing ecological consciousness. In their pursuit of wisdom through decades of disciplined study, we find an antidote to our modern culture of instant gratification. Their legacy is not a set of dogmatic rules to follow, but an invitation to look deeper, to learn continuously, and to find the sacred in the interconnected web of life around us. This is where the conversation truly begins, not ends. I'm deeply curious to know what part of this hidden history resonated most with you. Was it the immense intellectual feat of their 20-year oral education, the mystical connection between their calendar and the stone circles they inherited? Or perhaps the fascinating, complex evidence of their ritual life that challenges our modern sensibilities? Share your thoughts and your own questions in the comments below. Let's continue unraveling this mystery together. The story of the Druids is a collaborative one, written by all of us who remain fascinated by the shadows they cast across time, forever urging us to seek the wisdom hidden just beneath the surface of the known world.